The air in Dr. Collins's private clinic was imbued with a calmness that instantly put me at ease. Soft jazz floated in the background, mingling with the gentle hum of machinery, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting warm patches of light across the polished floor. It felt a world away from the bustling, impersonal feel of most dental offices. Here, in this quiet sanctuary, everything seemed tailored to promote relaxation. Dr. Collins had been my dentist for several years, but he rarely used this private clinic for appointments. Most of the time, I saw him in the larger practice he shared with a few other dentists across town. But today, he'd asked if I could come by here instead, mentioning that he had some new equipment he wanted to test, some sort of advanced imaging device he thought might be helpful. So I'd agreed, curious about this change in routine. When he entered the room, I felt a slight flutter in my chest, a reaction I couldn't quite explain. Dr. Collins was in his mid-60s, a reserved, dignified man with a streak of silver through his hair and an aura of quiet authority. He carried himself with a kind of timeless grace, as though he was untouched by the passing years. Today, dressed in a crisp white coat over a tailored shirt, he seemed even more put together than usual, and his familiar presence filled the room with a warm steadiness. "Good afternoon, Amy," he greeted, his voice smooth and reassuring, with just a hint of warmth that made my pulse quicken. "Thank you for coming by on such short notice." "Of course, Dr. Collins," I replied, feeling oddly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "Please call me Richard," he said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We've known each other long enough, don't you think?" I nodded, a shy smile tugging at my lips. "All right, Richard." The sound of his name felt strange yet satisfying on my tongue, adding a new layer of familiarity to our dynamic. He gestured toward the comfortable leather chair, indicating for me to sit, and I settled in, acutely aware of his proximity as he adjusted the equipment around me. "I'm testing some new imaging tools today," he explained, his tone calm and measured. "They're supposed to give a more precise view of the jaw structure, which can be useful for early detection of any dental issues." I nodded, listening to him intently, though I couldn't help but be distracted by the subtle details, the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth radiating from his hand as he brushed past me to adjust the settings on the machine. There was something reassuring about his presence, something that made me feel safe. And yet, beneath that safety, a faint thrill ran through me, like the tingling of an invisible line I knew I shouldn't cross. "All right," he said, his voice a gentle murmur. "This might feel a little strange, but it'll only take a moment." As he adjusted the device over my head, his hand rested briefly on my shoulder, a steadying touch that sent an unexpected warmth through me. I could feel the weight of his hand even after he'd moved away, and I found myself acutely aware of every small movement he made, of the quiet rhythm of his breath as he focused on the controls. The procedure itself was quick, and when it was over, he lowered the machine, giving me a warm, reassuring smile. "All done," he announced, his voice soft and calm. "Thank you for your patience." I met his gaze, feeling a slight flush creep up my cheeks. "Thank you, Richard. It's always nice coming here, feels different somehow." His eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked at me with an intensity that sent a ripple through me. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, his voice low, as though he was sharing a quiet secret. "This place that's special to me too." The way he said it, the subtle way his gaze lingered on mine, made my heart race. There was something in his expression that seemed to transcend our usual interactions, something I couldn't quite place, but felt deeply nonetheless. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine, and I felt the distance between us shrink, an unspoken connection humming in the space between us. "Sometimes," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, "we forget to slow down, to appreciate the simple things. I've always appreciated the time you've given me here." My pulse quickened, and I swallowed, feeling an unexpected tightness in my throat. His words, simple yet filled with a warmth that went beyond our usual rapport, left me feeling strangely vulnerable. I felt an urge to look away, to break the intensity of his gaze, yet I couldn't bring myself to move. "Me too," I managed, my voice soft. I think it's easy to forget that there's more to life than the routine. His hand lifted slightly, as if he was about to reach out, but he hesitated, letting it fall back to his side. And yet, in that small, unfulfilled gesture, I felt the weight of something unspoken, something both of us were too cautious to acknowledge. After a moment, he cleared his throat, as if breaking the invisible spell that had settled over us. "Would you like to see the images?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual professional tone. "Yes, I'd love to," I replied, eager to regain some sense of normalcy, even as the faint thrum of tension lingered between us. He led me over to the monitor, explaining the details of the images with the same calm, focused precision he always did. But I could feel the faint tremor in my pulse, a subtle undercurrent that seemed to echo the unspoken connection we'd shared moments before. As he pointed out different areas on the screen, his hand brushed mine, a brief but electric touch that seemed to ignite something within me, a spark that left me acutely aware of every small movement, every subtle shift in the air around us. For the rest of the appointment, we kept things light, exchanging small talk and polite smiles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There was a new layer to our interaction, a quiet intensity that simmered beneath the surface, waiting, perhaps, for a chance to reveal itself. When it was time to leave, he walked me to the door, his hand lingering on the handle as he held it open for me. "Thank you again for coming by," he said, his voice soft, his gaze steady and warm. I smiled, feeling the warmth of his gaze settle over me, filling me with a quiet joy. "Thank you, Richard, for everything." We stood there for a moment, a comfortable silence stretching between us, and I felt a strange reluctance to leave, a quiet yearning to linger in his presence just a little longer. "Until next time, then," he murmured, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips, and I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me as I stepped outside, carrying with me the memory of his touch, his gaze, and the quiet connection that had blossomed in the stillness of his private clinic. As I walked away, a part of me wondered if he felt it too, if he sensed the same unspoken bond that had begun to weave itself between us. And as the door closed behind me, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the threads of our connection would continue to tug at my heart, drawing me back to the warmth of his presence, to the quiet sanctuary we'd found in each other's company. A week passed, but I couldn't shake the lingering memory of that afternoon at Dr. Collins's clinic. His touch, his gaze, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name, all of it played over and over in my mind, a quiet melody that kept me company in the stillness of the night. I told myself it was silly, that it was nothing more than a fleeting moment, a brief exchange. But every time I thought of him, a thrill ran through me, something deep and undeniable that made my heart ache. So when I received a message from him, asking if I could stop by the clinic again to review some follow-up images, my pulse quickened, my mind racing with possibilities. I replied without hesitation, agreeing to meet him that evening. The hours leading up to the appointment seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with an anticipation I could barely contain. When I arrived at the clinic, it was quiet, the evening light casting long shadows across the polished floor. Dr. Collins, Richard, was waiting for me by the entrance, his expression warm, his eyes holding that familiar, steady intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Thank you for coming by again, Amy," he said, his voice smooth and calm. There was a softness in his gaze, a warmth that wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. "It's no trouble," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper as I took a step closer, feeling the subtle tension that hung in the air between us. He led me back to the exam room, the quiet stillness of the clinic making each step feel weighted, each moment stretched with unspoken anticipation. When we reached the room, he gestured toward the chair, and I sat down, my pulse quickening as he settled beside me, adjusting the monitor to display the images. "These are the follow-up scans," he explained, his tone calm and professional, though I could sense a faint tremor in his voice, a subtle indication that he was just as aware of the tension as I was. "I wanted to make sure everything looks as it should." I nodded, listening to him intently, though my mind was only half focused on the technical details. My attention was drawn to the quiet confidence in his voice, the subtle way he leaned in, his presence filling the small space around us. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, an invisible current that seemed to pull me closer, even as I tried to maintain a sense of composure. He pointed to a section of the image, his hand brushing mine in the process, a small, seemingly accidental touch that sent a shiver through me. I looked up at him, catching his gaze, and for a moment, we were locked in that quiet, shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had woven itself between us. "Everything looks good," he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine, his hand resting just inches from mine on the edge of the chair. "I'm glad we could catch this early and prevent any issues." "Thank you, Richard," I murmured, my voice trembling with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "I appreciate everything you've done." His hand lifted, hovering near mine, as though he was debating whether or not to bridge that final gap. There was a flicker of hesitation in his gaze, a quiet vulnerability that made my heart ache. And then, as if making a decision, he let his hand fall, his fingers brushing against mine in a gentle, lingering touch. "I enjoy our time together, Amy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze steady yet filled with an intensity that left me breathless. "I don't think I've ever connected with someone quite like this." His confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, and I felt my chest tighten with a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, a quiet, unspoken longing that made my pulse race. I wanted to respond, to tell him that I felt the same, but the words caught in my throat, lost in the quiet anticipation that surrounded us. Instead, I let my hand shift, my fingers brushing against his, a small, tentative gesture that spoke more than words ever could. His gaze softened, and he let his hand close over mine, his touch warm and steady, a silent promise that echoed in the space between us. The air grew charged, each breath heavy with the weight of the unspoken, each glance a quiet revelation. I could feel the pull between us, a magnetic force that defied logic, that transcended the boundaries we'd both tried so hard to maintain. Slowly, he lifted his other hand, his fingers tracing a soft path along my cheek, his touch light yet filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes as I felt the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his presence grounding me, holding me in the moment. "Amy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze, feeling the depth of his feelings reflected in his eyes. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet, unspoken confession that left me breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my gaze locked on his, every fiber of my being drawn to him, to the warmth and understanding that radiated from him. He hesitated, his thumb brushing gently along my cheek, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity that made my pulse race. "I don't want to cross any lines," he murmured, his voice soft yet laced with a hint of hesitation. "But I can't deny how much you mean to me." The words struck me with a quiet, powerful force, and I felt my heart swell with an emotion that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I knew this was uncharted territory, a place where logic and reason no longer applied, but I couldn't bring myself to pull back. Not when he looked at me like that, not when his touch sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. Maybe some lines are meant to be crossed," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my words a quiet admission of everything I'd been feeling, of the connection that had grown between us, defying explanation. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and I saw a warmth in his gaze, a quiet relief that mirrored my own. His hand lingered on my cheek, his fingers tracing gentle patterns that sent shivers down my spine, and I felt myself leaning into him, drawn by the quiet intensity, the silent promise that held us both captive. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, as though he were savoring every second, every subtle shift in the air around us. I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding as I surrendered to the warmth of his embrace, the steady strength of his hands grounding me even as my thoughts spun in a dizzying whirl. The kiss deepened, slow and unhurried, each touch a quiet revelation, a gentle exploration of the connection that had drawn us together. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the warmth, the quiet intimacy that surrounded us. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me, his gaze softened by an emotion I couldn't quite name, something deep and unguarded that made my heart ache. His thumb brushed gently over my cheek, a quiet, reverent touch that filled me with a warmth that seemed to settle into every corner of my being. "Amy," he began, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze never leaving mine. "I don't know what this means, but I know I don't want it to end." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my chest, a quiet sense of peace settling over me as I allowed myself to sink into the warmth of his presence. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, I knew that it was worth holding on to, that this connection was something rare, something precious. We sat together in silence, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the quiet intimacy, the simple joy of being close. And as the light outside began to fade, casting the room in a soft, golden glow, I knew that this moment, this connection, would remain with me, a cherished memory that would linger in my heart, no matter what the future held. The room fell into a hushed stillness, the soft, golden light casting long shadows across the walls, adding a dreamlike quality to everything around us. Wrapped in Richard's arms, I felt time stretch, as though the world outside had paused just to give us this one perfect moment. Every part of me felt alive, acutely aware of the warmth of his touch, the quiet strength of his embrace, and the steady beat of his heart beneath my hand. For a long time, we simply sat there, our breaths mingling in the silence, each of us savoring the unspoken connection that had blossomed between us. His hand traced slow, soothing patterns along my back, and I closed my eyes, allowing myself to sink into the calmness of the moment, to let go of the doubts and hesitations that had lingered in the back of my mind. But even in the quiet intimacy of that space, I felt a faint, undeniable undercurrent, a sense of anticipation, of something deeper waiting just below the surface. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and saw the same intensity mirrored in his eyes, a quiet hunger tempered by a gentleness that made my heart ache. He lifted his hand, his fingers brushing softly along my jawline, tracing a path that sent a thrill through me, igniting every nerve with a warmth that felt both exhilarating and grounding. His thumb brushed over my cheek, his touch light but filled with a reverence that made my breath catch, and I found myself leaning into him, drawn by the quiet magnetism that had woven itself between us. "Amy," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, laced with a vulnerability that left me feeling both seen and exposed. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but being here with you, it feels like everything I didn't realize I was missing." His words hung in the air, filling the space between us with a warmth that settled deep within me. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of excitement and fear swirling in my chest, and I realized, with a sudden clarity, that I felt the same, that this quiet, unexpected connection had filled a void I hadn't even known existed. "Richard," I replied, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I wanted to say but couldn't quite put into words. I feel it too." The faintest hint of relief flickered in his eyes, and his hand shifted, moving to cradle my face, his touch gentle but filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, as though he were savoring every second, every breath. This time, there was no hesitation, no reservations. I surrendered to the warmth of his embrace, the steady strength of his hands anchoring me as our kiss deepened, unhurried, but filled with a quiet urgency that left me breathless. His hand moved to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I felt my heart race, a thrill running through me as I let myself be swept up in the intensity of the moment. Our breaths mingled in the quiet of the clinic, the soft hum of distant machines fading into the background, leaving only the warmth of his touch, the quiet, unspoken promises that lingered in each kiss, each gentle caress. I felt his fingers tracing along my arm, a slow, reverent touch that made my skin tingle, and I found myself sinking further into him, lost in the quiet intimacy that had woven itself around us. After a long, lingering moment, we pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to steady ourselves. His hand remained on my cheek, his thumb tracing gentle patterns, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet joy that filled every corner of my heart. "I didn't expect this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and I could see the same vulnerability in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the uncharted territory we were navigating together. "Neither did I replied softly, my fingers brushing along his arm, grounding myself in the warmth of his presence. "But I don't want it to end." His gaze softened, and I saw a quiet acceptance there, a silent promise that, whatever this was, he felt it too, that he was just as committed to exploring the connection we'd found, no matter the challenges that might lie ahead. For the rest of the evening, we remained close, sharing gentle touches, quiet laughter, and whispered confessions that filled the spaces between us with a warmth I hadn't known I'd been missing. There was a sense of peace in his presence, a feeling of being understood, seen, and cherished in a way that went beyond words. As the evening turned to night, casting the room in soft shadows, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle over me, a quiet contentment filling the spaces where doubt and hesitation had once lingered. Richard's hand remained entwined with mine, his touch a steady, grounding presence, and I felt a warmth settle over me as he looked at me, his gaze filled with a quiet, unspoken promise. "Amy," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "whatever this is, it's special to me. I don't want to let it go." I tightened my grip on his hand, feeling the same resolve mirrored in my own heart, and I nodded, unable to put into words the depth of my feelings. "I feel the same," I replied softly, my voice trembling with sincerity. Together, we shared one last, lingering embrace, his arms wrapped around me, holding me close, grounding me in the warmth of his presence. As the night deepened, the quiet hum of the clinic fading into the background, I knew that, whatever the future held, this moment would remain with me, a cherished memory, a quiet reminder of the connection we'd found in each other. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the room, we pulled apart, sharing a final, parting glance filled with a warmth and understanding that transcended words. I knew that, though we were each returning to our separate lives, the memory of this night, of this connection, would remain a part of me forever, etched into the depths of my heart.